On the 8th of October 2017, 5:47 in the morning, Highway I-76, suburb of Philadelphia. Truck driver Thomas Bennett stopped his truck at the roadside when he noticed a woman walking along the edge of the road. In the dawn, she was walking barefoot, dressed in a faded blue dress that was unsuitable for the autumn coolness. As Bennett approached, the woman did not react to his presence. Her gaze was directed into emptiness. She moved like in a dream, Bennett recalls. I asked if she needed help, but she only repeated the same sentence over and over again. Mama must be back for dinner. I understood that something was wrong and called the police. The arriving patrol officers found the woman in a state of severe disorientation. She had no documents with her and could not give a name. On her left wrist, a scar from handcuffs was visible. Under her nails were traces of earth, as if she had been digging with bare hands for a long time. The woman was immediately taken to Montgomery Memorial Hospital. The attending physician, Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, documented numerous puncture marks on both arms of the patient. Blood analyses showed the presence of benzodiazepines and haloperidol, a strong combination of sedative and antipsychotic medications. The woman was exhausted with signs of vitamin deficiency and dehydration. When the effect of the medications wore off, she began to repeat the name Alice, notes Dr. Shaw. We were not sure whether she was naming herself or someone else. Through the fingerprint system, the police established the woman's identity. It was Lauren Marks, 37 years old, elementary school teacher from West Chester, Pennsylvania. According to police reports, Marks had been missing for 7 months. She disappeared on the 3rd of March 2017 after a parent-teacher conference at school. Lauren's husband, James Marks, came to the hospital immediately. The meeting of the spouses, which was recorded by the hospital camera, became the first oddity in this case. She looked at her husband like a stranger, tells investigator Rachel Morris, who was first assigned to this case. When he tried to hug her, she backed away and screamed, "You are not the father. Where is the real father?" In the next 48 hours, Lauren's condition remained unstable. Periods of relative clarity of consciousness alternated with episodes of panic and disorientation. In moments of clarity, she spoke sentences that seemed incoherent. Grandmother didn't wake up after the injection. Papa said we must smile in photos. Children may not cry at the table. The doctors diagnosed Lauren with post-traumatic stress disorder and amnesia caused by long-term intake of psychotropic substances. However, the real breakthrough in the case occurred on the 3rd day. It was a photo folded 3 times. On it was depicted a group of 5 people: an elderly woman, a middle-aged man, a woman, Lauren herself, a teenage boy, and Alice. They stood in front of a suburban-style house and held hands. All wore identical blue sweaters and smiled into the camera. But their eyes seemed empty and their postures unnaturally stiff. On the back of the photo was an inscription, "My perfect family, day 156. When investigators showed the photo to James Marks, he recognized no one except his wife. It proved impossible to identify the other people in the photo. Their faces matched no record in the missing persons database. Who were these people? What did day 156 mean? And most importantly, who had created this perfect family? After the discovery of the photo, the investigation took a new direction. Investigator Morris and her new partner, Investigator Michael Chen, began with a thorough analysis of the missing persons within 100 miles of the location where Lauren Marks was found. "We were looking for specific patterns," explains Chen, "people of different age groups who disappeared without apparent reason, without signs of struggle or suspicious activities before their disappearance. In the last 3 years, more than 200 people had disappeared in the region. Most cases had ordinary explanations: runaway teenagers, family conflicts, financial problems. But 22 cases stood out due to their inexplicability. People simply disappeared from their daily lives, after work, during an ordinary walk, on the way home from shopping. Particular attention was drawn to 6 missing person cases. Richard Goldman, 46 years old, accountant, disappeared on the 5th of January 2015 after a workday. Eleanor Washington, 68 years old, retiree, disappeared on the 14th of April 2015 from her house. Ethan Clayton, 14 years old, student, disappeared on the 7th of September 2015 on the way from school. Sophie Anderson, 9 years old, elementary school student, disappeared on the 12th of February 2016 from a playground. Margaret Thompson, 72 years old, retiree, disappeared on the 28th of July 2016 from a nursing home. Lauren Marks, 37 years old, teacher, disappeared on the 3rd of March 2017. At first glance, they had nothing in common, says Morris. Different age, social status, places of residence. But when we compared their photos with the image of the perfect family, we discovered matches of types. Each missing person could be one of the people in the photo. Furthermore, the chronology of the disappearances indicated a methodical approach by the kidnapper. First, the father disappeared, then the grandmother, the son, the daughter, and finally the mother. When the first grandmother, Eleanor Washington, disappeared from the family, a replacement was kidnapped, Margaret Thompson. Particularly disturbing was the discovery made during a renewed review of street camera footage in the area where Lauren had been found. On one of the recordings made 36 hours before Lauren's discovery, a black SUV was seen stopping at the roadside. From it was unloaded a large bundle that resembled a lifeless body and left in the roadside ditch. The vehicle's license plate proved to be forged. The examination of the soil found under Lauren's fingernails showed the presence of specific minerals and organic compounds, characteristic of agricultural areas in Chester County. This narrowed the search area but still left hundreds of square miles of potential territory. Lauren Marks' condition gradually improved. On the 10th day after her discovery, she was able to make the first coherent statements. "I remember a sound," she told the investigators. "Every morning at 6:40, a train passed by. That was my alarm clock. The father demanded that breakfast be on the table at 7 o'clock. When investigators asked whom she referred to as father, Lauren answered, "The person who created us. He said we were his true family, that he had chosen us." Lauren remembered that they were kept in a 2-story house with a basement, located in a rural area. The house was surrounded by cornfields. She particularly clearly remembered an old oak tree with a split trunk that was visible from the only window in the basement where they were held when they were not playing family. "He said we should be grateful," Lauren continued, "that he had saved us from loneliness and given us a perfect family, that he had tried it before with others, but they hadn't managed it." This statement prompted the investigators to consider, were there also other families before this one? How many people could have gone through this nightmare? Meanwhile, the forensic laboratory completed the analysis of the photo. The experts determined that the image was taken with a Nikon D3500 camera and printed on paper that is available in any major supermarket. On the back of the photo, however, microscopic soil particles were discovered that were identical to those found under Lauren's fingernails, as well as traces of a particular type of mold, Stachybotrys chartarum, which typically develops in old, damp rooms. Another detail caught the investigators' attention. In the lower right corner of the photo, the emblem of a real estate company on a "for sale" sign in front of the house is partially visible. The experts were able to identify the logo as that of Home Find Realty, a real estate agency operating in 5 districts of Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, a report came from the Montgomery County Children's Hospital about an unusual patient. Sophia, who was 9 years old, was brought to the emergency room with symptoms that suspiciously resembled drug poisoning. A farmer had found her at the edge of his field, about 40 miles from where Lauren was found. When investigators Morris and Chen arrived at the hospital, they were shocked. Sophia wore a blue dress, identical to the one Lauren Marks was wearing, and most importantly, she matched the description of Sophie Anderson, who had disappeared 7 months ago. On Sophia's left wrist, the same scar from a handcuff was visible as on Lauren. When the doctors removed her dress, they discovered a fresh tattoo on her back. Daughter, property of the family. The discovery of Sophie Anderson provided the investigation with crucially important information. Unlike Lauren, Sophie remembered more details despite the obvious psychological trauma. "The bad person took us away from our real parents," she said when she could speak. "He said that we are now his real family because he chose us."
Sophie told that the father forced them to live according to a strict schedule. Every day they had to portray a happy family, have breakfast, lunch, and dinner together, play board games, watch old family shows on television. On Sundays, he photographed them and marked Family Day on the calendar. When we did something wrong, he gave us medicine, so we would be obedient, Sophie continued. Grandmother didn't wake up after the medicine, and he brought a new grandmother. Sophie could remember that from the window of the basement, where they were held when they weren't playing family, not only a split oak tree was visible, but also railroad tracks. A passenger train passed by in the morning and evening, a freight train 3 times a day. This information made it possible to significantly narrow the search area. Meanwhile, the analysis of the Home Find Realty real estate agency database revealed that the company had sold 87 properties in rural areas of Chester and Lancaster counties over the past 3 years. Of these, 14 houses were located near railroad tracks, and only 3 had large trees in the yard. When investigators showed Sophie and Lauren photos of these houses, both independently pointed to the same image: a 2-story white house with blue shutters located on Miller Road, 5 miles from the nearest town. According to the database, the house was sold in January 2015 to a certain Daniel Harper. A check revealed that Daniel Harper was a fictitious person, created with forged documents. However, the real estate agent who handled the sale remembered this customer well. He was very specific in his requirements, recalls Linda Perkins, agent at Home Find Realty. He needed an isolated house with a basement, far from neighbors. He said he wanted peace for his family. He looked absolutely normal, friendly. He paid in cash. A task force prepared a plan to storm the house on Miller Road. Using thermal imaging cameras, the police discovered the presence of several people in the building. On the 22nd of October 2017, at 5:30 in the morning, a special unit surrounded the house. Through loudspeakers, the perpetrator was offered to surrender, but no response followed. After entering the house, the forces found 3 people chained to beds in the basement: an elderly woman, identified as Margaret Thompson, a middle-aged man, Richard Goldman, and a teenager, Ethan Clayton. All were under the influence of strong sedatives. On the back of each person was a tattoo marking their role in the family. The kidnapper himself was not found. Surveillance cameras in the house recorded how, 30 minutes before the operation, a man left the building through a secret passage in the basement that led to the forest behind the house. In the main bedroom, investigators found a kind of altar, a wall completely covered with photos of the family from different days. In each image, 5 people stood in the same pose with the same smiles. But the faces changed periodically, as if actors in a long-running series were replaced by new ones without changing the plot. Next to the bed lay an album with newspaper clippings about missing persons. Some were circled in red with annotations: possible mother, ideal son, too old for grandmother. But the most disturbing discovery awaited the investigators in the basement. Behind a false wall, they discovered a small room equipped with a refrigerator. Inside were containers with human organs and tissues carefully labeled with dates and names. He preserved parts of those who couldn't cope with their role, explains criminal psychologist Dr. Sarah Levin. In his disturbed consciousness, this was a way to keep them as part of the family, even after they had disappointed him.
The forensic examination identified the remains of 7 people who were reported missing between 2014 and 2017. All corresponded to the roles in the perfect family. A thorough examination of the house uncovered hidden cameras in every room, recording everything 24 hours a day. On the computer hard drives, investigators found hundreds of hours of video recordings of family life, meals, games, television watching. All actions seemed mechanical, unnatural, as if following a script. Recordings of punishments were also found. Victims who refused to play their roles were forced into obedience through deprivation of food, water, or injections of various preparations. Some recordings broke off when a family member stopped moving. Of particular interest to the investigation were the daily video diaries of the kidnapper, which he recorded in his bedroom. On them, a middle-aged man with ordinary appearance spoke about his mission to create a perfect family. "Today is day 178, he said in one of the recordings. "The mother is still resisting. I may need to find a replacement. The daughter is adapting best, beginning to call me Papa, even without reminders. Grandmother sleeps too much. I will increase the dose of stimulants." But who was this man? And what prompted him to create this nightmarish world? The analysis of fingerprints in the house led to an unexpected discovery. They belonged to Simon Baker, 41 years old, a former employee of the Montgomery County Social Services. According to official records, Baker quit his job in December 2014, after 12 years of exemplary service. He was a quiet, competent employee, recalls his former supervisor, Diana Miller. He specialized in cases where children were taken from problematic families. He never aroused suspicion. Colleagues described Baker as a reserved person, without close friends, but always polite and helpful. He never spoke about his family or past. He lived alone in a rented apartment and had no serious relationships. The only oddity that some noticed was his obsession with television shows from the 1950s and 60s that portrayed idealized family life. The investigation of Simon Baker's biography revealed a heartbreaking story. Born 1976 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, he was the oldest of 3 children in the Baker family. In the year 1983, when Simon was 7 years old, his father, who suffered from bipolar disorder, killed his mother and the 2 younger children in a state of psychosis before committing suicide. Simon, who had hidden in a closet, remained the only survivor. After the tragedy, the boy was placed in the foster system. In the next 11 years, he changed 7 foster families. In the reports of social workers, his withdrawn nature, difficulties in building emotional bonds, and a compulsive need for structured daily routine were recorded. In adolescence, he made detailed drawings of the perfect family, tells Dr. Martin Goldstein, a psychiatrist who worked with Simon from 1988 to 90. He fantasized about a family where no one ever argued, where everyone fulfilled their roles. That was his way of dealing with the trauma. After college graduation, Baker seemed to have overcome his past. He earned a degree in social work and began a career in the child protection system. Colleagues described him as a dedicated professional who was particularly effective in the most difficult cases. In the year 2014, however, an incident occurred that, according to psychologists, might have been a trigger. Baker dealt with the case of the Knight family, in which the father allegedly used violence against his wife and children. Despite Baker's recommendation to remove the children, the court left them with the parents. 1 month later, the father killed the entire family and himself, a scenario that painfully reminded of Simon's own trauma. 2 weeks after that, Baker resigned. And in January 2015, he bought a house on Miller Road under a false name and began creating his perfect family. The analysis of Baker's computers and documents showed that he carefully selected his victims. He used access to databases and his skills as a social worker to identify people who were suitable for his plan. Then he observed them for weeks and studied their habits before carrying out the kidnapping. Particularly shocking was the discovery of earlier experiments According to found diaries, Baker began with creating temporary families. He kidnapped homeless people, gave them drugs, and forced them to play roles for several days before releasing them with altered memory of what had happened. These cases were never investigated because the victims either could not remember details or were afraid to go to the police. By 2015, Baker had decided to create a permanent family. His method became increasingly sophisticated. He used a combination of preparations for behavioral control of the victims, strong enough to suppress resistance, but not so strong that they lost the ability to fulfill their roles. He created his version of a reality show, explains criminal psychologist Dr. Levin. But instead of actors, he used kidnapped people, and instead of a script, his childish fantasy of the perfect family that he never had. A particularly disturbing aspect of the case was the discovery of a list of candidates for replacing current family members. Baker had already selected a new mother and grandmother, observed them, and prepared for the kidnapping. On his computer's hard drive, photos of more than 30 potential victims were found, taken with hidden cameras in public places. The Federal Bureau of Investigation issued a nationwide search for Simon Baker. His photos were distributed to all law enforcement agencies in the country. On the 25th of October 2017, only 3 days after the storm on the house on Miller Road, there was an unexpected turn. The police of Baltimore, Maryland, received a call from a motel on the outskirts of the city. A chambermaid discovered in one of the rooms the body of a man who had committed suicide. Next to it lay a note: "Without my family, life has no meaning. Maybe next time I'll do everything right." The body was identified as Simon Baker. The investigation revealed that he had watched news reports about the rescue of his victims, whereupon he acquired a gun from an illegal dealer and booked a room in the motel under a false name. In the room, investigators found a stack of photos of the perfect family and a detailed plan for creating a new family in another state. Next to them lay newspaper clippings with advertisements for the sale of isolated houses in rural Virginia. The case of the perfect family did not end with the death of Simon Baker. For the surviving victims, it was only the beginning of a long road to recovery. Richard Goldman, Margaret Thompson, and Ethan Clayton, who were rescued during the storming of the house, joined Lauren Marks and Sophie Anderson in a specialized rehabilitation center. They all suffered from a combination of physical problems caused by long-term intake of psychotropic medications and severe psychological trauma. The most difficult thing for them was the return to consciousness of their own identity, explains Dr. Elizabeth Wright, the head of the psychology team that worked with the victims. Baker not only held them physically captive, he systematically destroyed their self-perception by forcing them to assume roles in his fantasy. All 5 surviving victims showed symptoms similar to Stockholm Syndrome, especially Sophie and Ethan, who had been in captivity the longest relative to their age. They felt complicated feelings toward their kidnapper: fear, hatred, but sometimes also dependency. He was a monster, but every day he said he loved us, that we were special, that he had chosen us, Sophie confessed during a therapeutic session. Sometimes I miss him, and then I hate myself for it. The return to families proved to be no less complicated a process. Relatives who had waited for their loved ones for years faced people who had changed beyond recognition. Some victims initially did not recognize their own family members or met them with distrust. Particularly difficult was the situation of those whose relatives had died in Baker's experiment. The families of Eleanor Washington and other victims, whose remains were found in the basement of the house, demanded answers: why the system could not protect their loved ones and prevent the tragedy. The investigation revealed serious deficiencies in coordination between law enforcement agencies of different jurisdictions. Disappearances that happened in different districts and states were processed in isolation, without analysis of possible connections between them. Baker knew the weaknesses of the system and used them, notes federal agent Michael Donovan, who coordinated the interagency investigation group. He deliberately selected victims from different districts and even states to make identification of patterns more difficult. Particular concern was raised by the fact that Baker, as a former social worker, used his professional knowledge for his crimes. He had access to confidential information about potential victims, knew the procedures for investigating missing persons, and the working methods of the police. In response to this case, the Federal Bureau of Investigation created a special database for tracking kidnappings with unusual circumstances. And the Department of Social Services revised the protocols for employee screening and monitoring access to confidential information. The psychological analysis of Baker's diaries and video recordings revealed the complex portrait of a person who was traumatized in his childhood and had created a parallel reality to compensate for his losses. In his disturbed consciousness, he did not consider himself a criminal, explains Dr. Levin. He believed that he was saving these people from an imperfect world by giving them a real family. The tragedy of the Knight family was probably the catalyst that finally destroyed the boundary between his fantasy and reality. For many, the contrast between Baker's abhorrent acts and his ordinary appearance, his professional successes, and the absence of a criminal past was shocking. This prompted society to reconsider stereotypical notions of how a dangerous perpetrator should look and behave. The most disturbing thing about this story is that Simon Baker could have been anyone, notes Dr. Wright. Your colleague, neighbor, someone you meet daily at the bus stop. No one saw his true face behind the mask of normality. 1 year after the events, all 5 surviving victims continue to be in rehabilitation. For some, progress is slow. Margaret Thompson, the oldest victim, suffers from irreversible cognitive impairments caused by long-term intake of psychotropic medications. Ethan Clayton, who spent almost 2 years in captivity during a critical phase of his development, has difficulties with socialization and learning. Richard Goldman struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder and cannot return to his former work. However, there are also stories of hope. Sophie Anderson shows remarkable resilience despite the nightmare she experienced. With the help of therapy and family support, she is gradually returning to a normal life, although she is still plagued by nightmares. Lauren Marks, whose escape marked the beginning of the case's exposure, became an active advocate for the rights of kidnapping victims. She founded a foundation to support survivors after long captivity and their families. He wanted us to be his perfect family, says Lauren. But a real family does not consist of smiles in photos or identical sweaters. It is about security, love, and acceptance. That is something no kidnapper can give, no matter how many sedatives he administers. The case of the perfect family has changed the methods for investigating missing persons and raised important questions about the psychological consequences of childhood trauma, the vulnerability of social protection systems, and society's blind spots that allow monsters to hide behind the mask of the everyday. The house on Miller Road was demolished by court order. In its place, the community plans to build a memorial garden in memory of the victims and as a reminder of the vigilance required to protect the most valuable thing, human freedom and dignity. But the most disturbing question remains unanswered. How many Simon Bakers are still hiding among us, creating their twisted fantasies behind the closed doors of ordinary houses?